Fala, Deves, tudo bom? Estamos online aqui para mais um dia. Estamos no nosso quarto dia? Olha, já estou um dia na frente. Nosso quarto dia de GameDevToolKit com a nossa primeira palestra em inglês, tá? Nossa segunda palestra internacional, a primeira em inglês. Não deixando vocês esquecer de deixar o like aqui na palestra, tá? Isso ajuda muito a gente. Se inscrevam no link que está aqui na descrição para participar do sorteio da Melies, tá? 100% de bolsa em fundamentos do 3D, um curso de extensão muito legal na Faculdade Artística número 1 da América Latina, tá? E também não se esquece de se inscrever no Eventri, porque se inscrevendo pelo Eventri você tem o sorteio também de um ano de licença do Construct, tá? Então, se inscreva nos dois, deixe seu like, curte aí o nosso canal, e agora vocês vão aproveitar uma ótima palestra com Luiz Roncayolo. Não sei se falei o nome correto, mas Luiz, welcome.
Nice Hi, Rafael. How are you?
I'm fine. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. Okay, so let us roll the presentation.
You are welcome. If you need me, I will be there.
Thank you, Rafael. Okay, well, good afternoon to everyone. As Rafael mentioned, my name is Luis Roncayolo. I'm going to talk a little bit about myself so that you know something of my background. Because today we're going to talk about narrative and how this interacts with the video game industry and how to introduce narrative in video games, right? So I studied political science to the master's degree. I did that in New York University. And even though it's it's political science, that actually pushed me in the direction of writing, right? Finishing the master's degree, I said, you know what, I'm going to put my knowledge into writing, and eventually that developed into a very prolific activity. And I have published 2 books at this point. One is a short story collection, and another is a novel. They are mostly historical fiction and also fantasy. So that also builds into my career inside the video game industry, which is what led me to Tagwiz. Tagwiz is a really remarkable company. It's based in Mexico, and it has grown tremendously since its foundation in 2014, offering services for other companies, but also creating games inside in-house games. Our founder, Adrian Jimatewelch, is a very experienced veteran of the video game industry. He is the one who brought me here and told me, hey, we're going to start producing narrative video games, and I see you are a writer and you have the vision, the fiction in terms of writing that we want to offer, to introduce in our games, right? And but besides that, like many of you, I'm also an avid gamer, and I have been a gamer since I was a young boy. Believe it or not, I played Pac-Man on an Atari 2600. Maybe many of you don't know that really old piece of machine, but it was like 4 or 5, and I thought it was amazing, right? And Space Invaders, all those games from the 70s that survived all the way into the 90s, I played many of those. And also the Super Mario Bros. When Nintendo came out. But the video game that first struck me to the core, and I can say that it's the video game that determined my preferences and also some of my fiction writing, was Age of Empires. I played that game when I was 11 years old, and I was totally enthralled by it, to the point in which I still play that video game. I played Age of Empires 2 with friends. Even today, it's more than 20 years since that. And, good times. Okay, so I just wanted you to know a little bit about me before we start. Video game narrative, a marriage between two elements, creative writing and game design. This is what I'm going to be talking about today. Okay, so this is a summary of my presentation so that you know where we're going. First, well, you see it's structured in three different sections. This has to do with something that I'm going to be talking further on, which is the narrative structure divided in three acts. I'm trying to replicate that into the content, into the way I'm going to present the content to you guys. So first, I'm going to talk about video game narrative in general. What is it that they bring new to the table, to the narrative art in general, and how the gaming and fiction writing intertwine, right? Okay, I'm followed. I'm going to talk about what's narrative all about. I'm going to depart a little bit from video games at this point to tell you about the three-act structure and the importance of the hero and how, you know, this hero is introduced in video game stories as well as movies and, you know, novels. And finally, I'm going to come to the synthesis of these two, which is narrative through gameplay. And I'm going to use an example of a video game that I really enjoyed. You're going to see which video game it is at the end. And I will finish with some thoughts about the future of narrative in video games. And after that, we can move to Q&A, to questions. All right? All right, let's proceed. So, video game narrative. The reason why I put Pinocchio here in this slide is because I think Pinocchio represents very well, it's a really good symbol of what we're trying to do here. Because Pinocchio comes, well, it means two things for us that are important for us today. First, Pinocchio is the product of fiction writing. It's a fictional character, very popular fictional character. That is the realm of the writers.
1 second. Your presentation, probably you put the wrong screen to present. We are not seeing what your Pinocchio or now it's moving. We are seeing this. Yes.
All right. Right now?
Probably you need to representation. It's
like this.
Yeah, you have another screen in your computer.
No, I'm in a laptop.
No, it's your screen. This screen right now, it's your screen, right?
Yes.
Okay, it's what we're looking for. Okay, thank you.
So what you're saying is that you cannot see the slides?
Now I am seeing. You were talking about Pinocchio, but it was in the first slide yet.
And right now, can you see it?
Now I can see Pinocchio. Okay.
Yes? Okay,
yes.
Great. Yes, sorry. By the way, this is the Pinocchio by Guillermo del Toro's recent film. It's a great film. Pinocchio is two things. It's a fictional character, which is the realm of writers, but it's also a toy. And a toy is something we play with, which is exactly what we do with video games. Now, video games are very sophisticated toys, but ultimately that's what they are. It's a product built in order for us to play. And Pinocchio is both a fiction character and a toy to play. And also, by the way, when he lies, his nose grows. And the reason why I tell you this is because there is some people say that fiction writing is writing lies. Because technically this is correct, because the writer, the fiction creator, invents stories that are not necessarily true. But that's actually beside the point, because there's an agreement between the writer and the reader, between the film director and the viewer, in which both engage in enjoying a work of fiction. So even though what I'm going to tell you is not actually true, maybe it holds a truth behind it in the form of a metaphor. And this is something that has been done by narrative, since the early beginnings of civilization. And now is getting very popular in video games. Video games are taking this narrative phenomenon and presenting it to the new generations in very drastically new ways that we're going to explore. So you have to understand the video game developer standing in a similar relationship to the player as the writer to the reader. We have an agreement in which the developer offers something and the player is willing to give it a chance, to try it, to see if the player can enjoy this product, this story that we're presenting, right? Okay, so what's new about video games as narrative? The first thing is that this is where video games take off from narrative tradition and can actually become a narrative form of their own, not attached to film, not attached to literature, but its own thing. And the first element that changes everything is that the viewer takes the hero's role. And this basically means that the viewer is no longer a viewer, but the player. The reason why this is so important is because it drastically changes the relationship between the creator and the person who is looking at the work. Here, we're basically giving the viewer or the player the ability to decide where the story is going to go and how fast it's going to go. When you read a novel, your character is there. You're contemplating your character, you're living through the character, but you're not you're not actually determining the character's actions. In a film, something very similar happens. We're looking at these characters as they move, but according to the director's orders, not according to yours. In the case of video games, there is a feedback given from the viewer that is not simply giving an opinion, but actually a feedback as the story develops. So we have the story moving forward, and the story moves because the player is interfering in the story and making decisions. This is one of the most unique aspects of video game narrative, and this is why it's so interesting and novel. And I don't think it is a good question. It is good to ask ourselves, how much have we taken advantage of this, right? So what happens on screen is up to the player. What happens on a film theater is up to the director, and what happens in a novel is up to the writer. But what happens in a video game is a combination. It's determined by the developer, but then the player is the one choosing the tempo of dramatic action. And by tempo, I mean the time that it film, for instance, when you write screenplays, you usually have your first 30 minutes of every movie to present the character and for a plot point number one to occur. The plot point is that event that changes the life of your character and moves it into the direction of the story that you're going to tell in the movie, right? I'll give you an example. In The Godfather, for those who have seen it, you remember that they introduced this beautiful family, this beautiful Italian family celebrating a wedding and how they live and how they are. But and out of the blue, suddenly the Vito Corleone, the boss of the family, is ambushed by two gangsters and shot on the street. And suddenly everything changes. The movie moves into a totally new direction that places the hero, Michael Corleone, in his journey to become the boss of the family. Video games are not different in this sense. We usually introduce our character in context, but when plot point number one happens, it's not up to the screenwriter or to the developer. It's up to the player. Some players might rush to the plot point number one because they're interested in knowing the story, because they just care about the story. And it might take them 15 minutes to get there. But other players like to wander around and they like to explore the world created by the developers. They might interact with NPCs and so forth. And maybe they get to plot point number 1 in 2 hours or 3 hours. So this is very different, and very different from normal narrative, and it's something that every video game developer must bear in mind. Of course, there are examples in which you can push the player into the direction that you want before you give him more freedom. An example of this is the Mass Effect series. I don't know if you played Mass Effect, but in Mass Effect 3, you have the main hero in the middle of when you begin the game, right away, there's an alien invasion that totally introduces you into an action quest in which you have to escape, and then you travel to Mars, and then in Mars you get the plot point, you find the information that you need in order to continue the rest of the game. But the developers, what they did is that they forced you towards the plot point. You can do that as a developer, but it's you need to understand that it is important that the player has the freedom to decide when that's going to happen, which takes us, of course, to the conclusion that video games are the most immersive narrative form to date. It's immersive because, differently from everything else, the viewer is the hero. And the viewer, the developer decides how much freedom do you want the player to have when taking the role of the hero. In this sense, video games are very similar to role-playing games, like playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? You have your character, you have the player embodying one of the... Give me a second. Give me just 1 second. It's full screen. Rafael, I have a question. Is my presentation full screen?
No, you probably you shared the window with us, not the screen. So we are looking the not full screen.
Okay, let me just see if I can share it again.
Try to share your full screen or the window of the full screen presentation.
Okay, that's what I'm going to do now. Right? Full screen might be the solution, right? Okay, full screen. Okay, now?
No, let me see. Nothing happened yet. So presentation, share screen. Don't you have the? Let me think.
Right now.
Yeah.
Can you see it?
Okay. So yeah. Yes. Try. Yes. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah. It was so interesting that the presentation was nearly unneeded, but if you did it, it probably will be better with it.
No, it's okay. You don't have. I mean, this is just a backup.
Yes.
So basically, what we have here is that a writer immerses the reader through some techniques. The filmmaker has his own techniques to introduce the viewer. What are the techniques used by developers to introduce the player, right? To generate this immersion effect in which you are no longer staring at a story from outside, but you're inside the story. This is something that is really remarkable about video games. And one of the reasons I joined in this industry in the first place was this interest to explore what can we do, everything that we could do with these possibilities, right? And I think that the video game industry is just starting to scratch the surface of its own possibilities. I don't think we have come to the full fruition of everything we can accomplish. And this is, I ask you this question: how much have we taken advantage of this fact? The fact that this is the most immersive narrative form to date. I don't pretend to answer this question. It's just a question for the forum. Take a look, since we started having video games around in the 70s until today. Video games have changed a lot, but how far can we go? I think there's a lot of way to go still yet in how we tell stories using the tools offered by video games. Okay, so here we have how gaming and fiction writing intertwine. I offer you this this graph in which on one side, on the opposite side, you have everything that it's a game design, level design, mechanics, etc. And these are games that are not narrative. For instance, Tetris or Angry Birds. All of those games that don't have story but have mechanics that are very fun. They don't need a story. They just need to be fun. That's it. In that sense, they don't have a story. They're not narrative, and they don't concern us here because they are a creature of their own. And on the opposite side, we have purely narrative forms, which is structure, plot points, character development. Here we have novels, series, movies, opera, you name it. It's every story presented to us, and we are outside. And suddenly, these two worlds intertwine, and video game narrative through gameplay is born, which is something that has of both worlds, but has a unique cultural identity and impact of its own. And basically, I've created this axis, and I have invented these words, which they seem right to me when I was studying for this presentation. When you have a story, everything that is inside the video game narrative through gameplay, that shaded area where they intersect, you can move in video game stories very close to the purely gaming element, which basically presents you a story in the shape of a corridor. So your story moves forward, it doesn't move backwards. You just simply, and you create a level, all the levels that you design and all the challenges that you present move in just one direction. And on the opposite side, you have what I call a step. Now, a step is open, and you can go anywhere you want, and you can go back. So here are those games that the story goes where the player wants to go. If the player is fulfilling a quest but then wants to go back, the player can go back. And the story is wherever the player goes to search for adventure. Obviously, these are general categories. All the video games usually fall in the middle between these two extremes. But to give you just a couple of examples, Half-Life, I don't know if you remember Half-Life, it was such a remarkable game 20 years ago, is a corridor type of story. You begin inside a lab, like, I don't know, like in the basement number 20, and then you start going up as aliens attack you, and you uncover a story. But basically what you do is that you traverse through level design, and the story goes in one direction. You can't go back. An example of a step story would be Skyrim or the Elder Scroll series, in which the player is presented with a central quest, but then is presented with a series of other quests that are not necessarily side quests. They're so complex and so elaborate that they're a quest on their own, and you can say that the player plays whatever story he or she feels like. And the result is that the narrative being shown on screen depends on whatever the player decides. And this is the most radical type of narrative freedom given to the player. In the middle, you have plenty of games. Most of the games are in the middle. Mass Effect is a step sometimes, but then when you go into a quest, it becomes a corridor. So you move between a straightforward quest, and then you go to the galaxy, and then in the galaxy mode, you explore, you move, you go everywhere you want, and you explore the game in the order that you want. Or the Deus Ex, it's another example. You have these different hubs, and you explore those hubs, and you move in the main quest, but then the main quest is kind of changed as you move through side quest, so it's also like in the middle. Give me a second. All right. So why is this important? Because this decision determines level design or vice versa. So depending on the story you want to tell, you know how should your levels be designed. If you want your levels to move in one direction, or if you want them completely open, determines in what type of story do you want to tell. Or the opposite. If you have a game in mind, but you don't have a clearly defined story, then you can draft the story to match your level design. What we should never do is create level design and create a story on the other side without communicating, because then contradictions will start to pop up, right? And you will start having contradictions where the story is poor or the level design is poor, and one of the two elements falls short of the player's expectations. All right. So when they communicate and you create the level design required by your story, or you create your story required by your level design, the result is a much more integrated game that the player is going to enjoy more. Okay, so let's move into narrative. What's narrative all about? Basically, well, narrative is as ancient as civilization itself. I already mentioned this before. The first civilization we know of is the Sumerians, and we have an epic tale, the Gilgamesh, that dates back to the Sumerians, the very early cities of the ancient world. And we have epic stories and myths from ancient Egypt. And we have from China, from India, from everywhere. So we have been telling stories for quite a while. And I can even say that they're older than civilization, because when we watch those paintings on those caves, you know, the paintings painted by cavemen, they usually have movement. They're usually hunters, a hunter hero after a group of gazelles or a bull, or trying to tame a horse. They're not static. They imply movement. And this movement has dramatic action, and that's narrative. That means that probably there was a storyteller using those paintings behind him to elicit more vividly what he wanted to do. Now, take that cave storyteller, move 10,000 years, 20,000 years toward our time, and that storyteller is a game developer. A game developer that wants to develop a narrative video game, of course. And this is pretty much the tradition in which video games are trying to get on board. We're trying to get on board on a tradition that is very old. And as we board this tradition, the first thing that we realize is that it already has a set of rules. Rules that when we follow, our video game stories end up better. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so give me a second, please. Okay, so let's talk about the 3-act structure. This is something that was first, it was discovered by Aristotle, the ancient Greek philosopher. So it's a theory, it's one of the most influential theories in art, because since that time when he realized that Greek drama and Greek epic followed these 3-act structure, it has determined storytelling for the last 2,000 years or more. And what we have here is basically, right now, is quite commonsensical. It's common sense for everyone to understand everything as introduction, presentation and conclusion. But this is how much this theory have become part of the everyday culture. So much that today, when you do a corporate presentation before a group of, I don't know, investors or whatever, you follow this structure, just as this structure is followed in movies, is followed in books. And one of the interesting things is that next time you watch a movie or a video game, well, not a video game, let's focus on movies. Next time you watch a movie and you realize that the movie is boring, ask yourself why. Why is it boring? And most likely it's boring because it's not following this. Because this structure is what allows the story to move in the direction that keeps the viewer hooked. When we start to follow short of this structure, usually what happens is that the whole thing, starts to stagnate, to become, boring. And well, these are the three acts. We have an opening, a confrontation, and a resolution. In the opening, we introduce our hero. And the traditional way of introducing your hero is in the context, in his everyday context. So if you have a warrior, you can introduce him in a battle, like in Gladiator, or if you have, let's say, Kingdom Come. That's the video game that I wanted to bring to your attention. In Kingdom Come, I think that video game has a great introduction to the hero, because you are a peasant in the Middle Ages in Bohemia, and you begin being this young peasant that would like to know how to wield a sword. But your father doesn't like that idea. Your father prefers you to be a smith rather than a swordsman, because he knows that being a swordsman is dangerous. So the game introduces the player in a rural context, in a countryside context, and a character that has a drive to become a warrior, but his context doesn't allow it until plot point number one. Plot point number one is the dramatic interruption. Something happens in the life of our hero that suddenly breaks his life into moments. The moment of innocence just takes a step back, and suddenly a situation forces him to take a different direction. And this direction is usually the hero's journey, in which he's trying to find who he wants to be, or she wants to be, depending on whether the character is male or female, right? We have both. We have example of great male and female characters in video games and film. In the case of Kingdom Come, what happens is that you're this farmer, you're this peasant in what today is the Czech Republic, and your town, your village is attacked by a group of Cuman warriors, which are steppe nomads from the Ukraine, modern Ukraine. And they destroy the village, and your family is killed, and you're forced to flee with the rest of the refugees to a different town. So this plot point number one, this dramatic interruption, forces the character being impersonated by the player to become what he wanted to become before the plot point. So you see there's a connection here that it's very important to establish when you set your hero in your context and you make that turn. In film, for instance, that plot point number one can come, as I mentioned, minute 15, minute 20, minute 30 at most. But in a video game, it's up to the player. It can take 1 hour, 2, 3 hours. It depends on him. So developers must always keep this in mind in order for the game not to stall too much. And then, the player might just drop it because nothing is happening. So how are you giving the player the information that he needs in order to get moving? So we have the confrontation. Here is when the hero is presented with multiple challenges, usually by a villain, but not necessarily, but usually by a villain, or maybe the situation is terrible and the hero needs to overcome a group of challenges. In video games, these are quests. This is very important because this is where most of the video game takes place. This is where the hero levels up, where the hero gains new abilities, where the hero gains new weapons. And as the hero progresses in the story, the weapons, the abilities, the skill sets that the game is giving as the hero levels up is always at the level of the challenge being presented. There are games that don't do this. There are games in which that present you with challenges that you cannot overcome right away. Witcher is an example, Witcher 3. But, those are the exceptions. Most of the game takes place during confrontation. And after a lot of confrontation, you get to the plot point final, which is the final piece of information that pushes towards the climax. Okay, so there's a moment in which every video game needs to wrap up. Not all video games do that, by the way. Skyrim definitely is one that doesn't do this. So there are exceptions. But usually when you are telling a story, you want the player to get to the ending, because that's the whole point of creating a villain, of creating a dramatic situation, right? So we want to lead the player toward that final moment. Here comes to mind in the first Mass Effect, after your introduction, your opening, where the hero is introduced, you have hours of gameplay, many hours of gameplay in which you create your party. You find the other NPCs that will join your party, and every NPC is usually related to a quest. And you have all these multiple quests that also allow your own character to grow in abilities. Also, the player is learning to play better, and usually everything ends with a particular mission in which the final piece of information is given. For instance, the villain's final purpose. In Mass Effect, the villain Saren is this crazy alien that wants to he wants to use a technology that brings about an alien invasion from a different galaxy. You find this piece of information in the very mission that ends the confrontation moment, and that leads you toward the ending. And the ending, of course, the resolution, the climax, is usually a final boss. The typical final boss battle that it's a classic of all video games is exactly that. Once you are presented with the final boss, and once you defeat this challenge, usually the story ends, or the developers send you to credits, or maybe they give you a little bit of gameplay, but that's it. There are some exceptions. There are some end game modes that allow you to keep playing a video game once you finish the story. For instance, the New Game Plus is something that is styled in some games. I think in the Souls-like video game, this is something that it's common. But that's already beyond the narrative. The player already finished the story, so that's a different subject, right? I'm going to give you an example of a great final boss battle that built a lot of climax toward it, and it's Zelda Ocarina of Time, the final fight against Ganondorf, the villain of Zelda. That is a great video game from the Nintendo 64. I still remember when I finished it. Even that final battle, if I remember correctly, has different stages. It's very common that you're playing against the final boss and you kill the boss, and then emerges in a new transformation, and then a final transformation. Sometimes they have 3 different transformations, which is exactly the narrative structure of 3 acts. You have an introduction to that battle. You have a moment in the middle of that battle, and then you have a conclusion of the battle. So this 3-act structure can be replicated in different moments of the game, even in different quests. You have the 3 acts of the whole game, and then you have 3 acts in every quest. And believe me, this is going to assure you that the player is going to have a good time and is going to enjoy the story that you're telling him or her. Okay, so another aspect that is crucial to understand narrative, The power of narrative is your hero. You only have one chance to make the player fall in love with your hero. And this is something that happens at the opening, in the act 1. You present your hero in context, and you throw your hero into plot point number 1. But if you don't make the player fall in love with the character in the opening, then most likely he will abandon the game because he just doesn't feel the connection. He just thinks that this can be quite subjective because we relate to characters in a very individual way. But even when you create a character that some people don't like, if his or her presentation is well done and well written, they will buy into it. This is something that you must always keep in mind. Your character must be interesting. Otherwise, the story falls short. There are different types of heroes in video games. I'm going to give you 3 possibilities. Sometimes the hero is set in aspect, in personality, and in abilities. So you only play with a character they already give you, like in Max Payne in the game Max Payne. Sometimes the character is set in aspect, physical aspect and personality, but not in abilities, so the player can decide what abilities to select for the character, for the hero. An example is Deus Ex Adam Jensen. Or in more, in the RPG video games, the aspect is not set, nor the personality, nor the abilities. So you can do pretty much whatever you want with your character. And Mass Effect Shepard is an example of that. Skyrim is an even more radical example of how your character can be so unique to the player. It depends on how you want your player to interact with your hero. That will determine the type of game that you want. So if you want a very straightforward story, you cannot give the player so much freedom, because then maybe the character that the player creates doesn't match the story. So it depends. You need to create an equilibrium between these different factors. And don't forget that all of these elements, let me just go back. All of these elements are game mechanics. And these game mechanics are the tools through which the player interacts with the hero. So the game, depending on the story that you want to tell, you need to create the game mechanics appropriate for that story. Right? This is very important because hero is all in video games, because hero is the player. Interesting characters, endearing characters can capture an age's imagination. And I just want you just think about great characters of recent culture. You have Luke Skywalker, you have Neo from Matrix. All of these characters, when they're very well created in a really interesting story, they inspire people in their daily lives, in the way they dress, in the philosophies that they follow, in the way they confront life. It would be good to ask ourselves in the video game industry, how many characters like this have we created, if any? I don't know. I leave it to the forum to decide on that. And basically, this leads us to our synthesis and our conclusion: narrative through gameplay. When we multiply narrative by gameplay, what follows is narrative through gameplay. This is different from narrative plus gameplay, because in narrative plus gameplay, what you have is 2 parallel things running in parallel, but they don't interact with each other. It was very common 10 years, 15 years ago that the video games had a gaming moment. You were playing the game, you were beating the challenges, and then suddenly you get to a plot point and you're introduced to a cinematic. The cinematic places you as a viewer, and you're only looking at the story, and then you go back to gaming. But they are really not integrated well enough. I think video games should move in the direction, they are already moving in the direction that the story moves alongside the game mechanics, which is this: narrative through gameplay is a good marriage of convenience, is when story advancement occurs as a consequence of player interaction with game mechanics. So this is where the team of game design needs to be in constant communication with the team, with the narrative creation team, because they need to know what they're doing for this whole thing to be well integrated. Sometimes the writer is a game designer, or sometimes the game designer is the writer. In both cases, we should not work in the pipeline of production, the production pipeline of video games. We should not place this too far apart, because otherwise contradictions will emerge during gameplay and players will notice. They always notice. And an example of this is Shadow of Mordor. I don't know if you have played this game, but it's a great game. I'm not going to talk about the second Shadow of War. Shadow of Mordor is enough. They introduced something called the Nemesis system. This is a game that takes place in the Lord of the Rings world. The hero is trapped in the land of Mordor, which is the land of shadows, where the Dark Lord Sauron rules, and it's a land full of orcs. And here the game basically divides all the orcs in gangs, and gangs into tribes. And every tribe has a chieftain, and the gangs have their leader. And the system is very interesting because you interact with it, you kill some orcs, you help some other orcs to raise in the ranks, and the result is that as you interact with this game system, the story moves forward, because the story is about how you interact with the Nemesis system. Eventually you develop a Nemesis of your own, an enemy, an orc that keeps killing you and becomes very strong, and he's your personal enemy. Your personal enemy in that game, which is different from the personal enemy that a different gamer will have. And I find that extraordinary. But it had an error, though. And the error was that the Nemesis system was introduced too soon. It was introduced a little bit before the player gets hooked with the main story. So what happened was that it happened to some players. It didn't happen to me because I followed the story. I followed straight to the story. It happened to some players that they got hooked with the Nemesis system without getting into the story. And the result is that they accumulated hours of gameplay without getting moving into the story, and eventually they ask themselves, what am I doing? This game is going nowhere. So this is how important it is to make the right decision of when to introduce your great gameplay idea into the context, into the narrative context, so that they don't compete against each other, but they help each other. And finally, these are some thoughts about the future of narrative in video games. Last year was quite momentous in terms of technology advancement. The impact of artificial intelligence is enormous. I think this decade will be determined by how we integrate artificial intelligence into gaming, into NPC character dialogues, into I don't know, just you name it. And ChatGPT is for text generation, and DALL-E for image generation are two examples of these incredible artificial intelligence that is a revolution that is happening right now, and it will definitely leave its mark in video games. I'm not sure exactly where it's going to go, but definitely we have to get on board of this, or those developers that don't are going to fall behind. And this is where I get to questions and answers. Thank you.
Very nice, very nice. Very interesting, your presentation. Let's see if the chat has some questions. We take like some minutes para a presentation. Indeed it is. We have one here. As an indie developer, how can I test my game's narrative is good enough? if my game's narrative is good enough, from beginning to end of the history.
Okay, how to test it? It's an interesting question because testing assumes that you are you're showing the game to other potential players, maybe your friends, maybe people inside the company. The first thing is, I would say, analyze the narrative structure. Are you following a narrative structure? Are you creating a first act that is clear enough in which your hero is presented in terms that are relatable? Are you following this opening with a moment, a dramatic interruption? Try to identify this point. Usually, this point is where the villain comes in, or hints about the villain appear for the first time, and then just let the player accumulate experience before the conclusion. You can do this analysis. It's abstract. It's something that you do without testing it. It's you using your mind to analyze it. But in order to test it, I'd suggest you can role play it. You can ask a group of inside workers inside the company, inside your company, or maybe friends, to kind of practice a little bit of role play just to see if the story is interesting. I'd say those would be good ways. The other is just to develop the game and then showcase it, but then the game would have already be developed. But maybe you can do some changes. So that, yes, I hope I answered your question.
Nice. There's another one. How to create a summary narrative flow to get a general idea of the game script to introduce the theme.
I'm sorry. Can I read that? Can I read that question myself? Because
It's
I'm
in
not.
your screen, probably. Go
I'm
to
sorry.
our go
Give me a
to
second. Let me just take a look at it.
yes.
Uh, okay, how to create a summary narrative flow to get a general idea of the game script to introduce the theme. Okay, great. Here, my suggestion would be to actually, well, let me go back to this slide. Just throw. Are you seeing how I interact with the presentation?
Yes.
Okay, so write a couple of sentences for this, write a couple, 2 or 3 sentences for this, and maybe write 1 or 2 sentences for this. I mean, you use your own words. This game starts in the Middle Ages in Bohemia. You're a farmer. Your village is attacked by nomads, by barbarians, and destroyed, and you lose your family and have to fly and have to run from home. Then you dedicate the rest of the game to train to become a swordsman. And then finally, well, I didn't finish Kingdom Come, so I don't know how it ends. But you know, I don't know. I hope this answered your question. I mean, just create very few words. Give me a couple of sentences of every of these 3 moments, and probably that will do the work.
Great. Another one. Just love your presentation. Thanks for sharing. Thank you, Dara Luna. Another one. Can you go to the screen? I think it will be better if you read it yourself than I do it for you because my
Okay,
English
okay,
isn't
okay.
the best one.
I'm sorry. How much of narrative must be cut, reduced in the actual game order to make the main moment dynamic? I mean, the player not getting bored after reading lots and lots of text. Well, this depends a lot on the target gamer that you are trying to get at, because I am the kind of gamer that likes to read. I played Dungeons and Dragons games like Baldur's Gate, like Neverwinter, the recent games of that type, and but that's me, right? If you, for instance, compare it to Call of Duty, they have absolutely nothing in common. So it depends on the type of audience that you're looking to capture with your game. If you want a very dynamic game in which people don't spend too much time in reading or in viewing cinematics, then that already tells you the type of gamer that you're looking for. You need to make sure that the game meets those expectations, but it's very relative. There's no like rule to determine how much. I'd suggest comparing it to a similar game. Is your game a shooter? Then you should evaluate how much time do Call of Duty cinematics take, or is it an action adventure? You can go to a Metal Gear, compared to Metal Gear. Is it a role-playing game, an RPG? Well, maybe Mass Effect or Baldur's Gate if it's very oriented toward reading. It depends on your objective. There are fun, great games on both sides of the spectrum.
Great. You can quit the presentation, I guess. Just a personal question, if you want to ask. If you want to answer.
Why do you think of gameplay attracts you most? Okay, well, here I think it's an interesting question. It's difficult. It requires a lot of self-reflection, right? I'd say the games that I play the most are strategy games. So they're competitive. In that sense, I would say I'm an achiever. The achievement is to defeat my rival. I still play Age of Empires, but when I play a narrative game like Deus Ex, I always like to complete the main story. It's all about, tell me what story do you have in mind, show me your hero, show me your villain, let me enjoy the story and let me go all the way to the end. I want to see the end of this game and the final confrontation. There are gamers that they just prefer to beat the challenge. There are gamers that prefer to explore the whole world. No, I usually try to go for the main quest, and I explore a little bit, but not that much. And in terms of socialization, I socialize in terms of strategy games. So that's it. If I can I add something else? That's the last question, right?
We depends on you. If we have one more until now, but it's your time. If you
Okay.
if you
No,
can
but you tell me how
stand
much
a little.
time do we have
No,
to wrap
we
up?
can
Or?
go a little bit more. No problem.
Okay, let's take one more question.
Okay. It is.
Okay, how can you manage the narrative of a game that focuses on a specific target audience? Well, it depends on the target audience. It's similar to a previous question. Is your target audience, are they hooked up by shooters or by strategy or by what? Remember that narrative is a hook, but you should never forget gameplay. And this is different from films and from novels and from television, is that no matter how good a story you have, if your gameplay is not good, the player will drop it. Because ultimately, the player interacts with your story through that gameplay. Any defects to the gameplay, any too complicated or too difficult, or will only make the player drop the game, even if your story is great. So this is why it's so important. Work hand in hand with game designers. And the game designer will tell you, I have been in this position before, listen, that part of the story is too much. The players are not going to go for that. And I have to yield. And I say, well, maybe I just wanted to become too much of a Dostoevsky. This is video games, right? Not, you know what I'm saying? And you have sometimes to make some sacrifices. And game design will tell you when something meets the expectation of the game and when something just simply moves away and just takes the player in a direction that the player might not necessarily want to go, because the player is there to play, right? And if you can show him a great story, so much the better. But the core, it's a game. I think we should never forget that.
Okay. We have another one from Luis.
Okay, how do I present a narrative and evaluate its quality during production to test concepts? Well, again, just you have to analyze it according to the 3-act structure. See if you're meeting those 3 stages of the development of a story. You can also watch some movies. You can go watch Star Wars. You can go watch The Godfather, Matrix, and you see exactly, okay, here's where this part of the story goes, and this is this part of the story. This is the beginning. If you start to apply that knowledge into all the works of fiction that you see out there, you will start doing that for your game too. And you will realize it. This is a moment in which the story is not going in, it's stalled or it's slowed down. So here also creating your outline and showing it to other friends or colleagues or critics, just to see what they tell you, that might help a lot. But it could be subjective, but we reduce the subjectivity by applying the structure.
Great.
Okay, before we finish, can I?
Of course.
Right. So and this is an exercise. Let me just go all the way to the end. Okay. Before we finish, I wanted to give you a little bit of homework. Of course, this homework is totally optional. You do it if you want. If you don't, it's okay. But for those of you who really would like to develop narrative video games and are very excited to do that, the best way to train your eye is by analyzing with these concepts other works, especially the ones that you like the most, the ones that you enjoy the most, that you analyze those. And well, this is the exercise. Pick your favorite video game story. Remember, focus on the story, not on the gameplay. Pick your favorite video game story and analyze the opening and how long the villain takes to appear. Does it appear in the first scene? Does it appear in the second? Does it never appear? It's only mentioned. Analyze that. Does it take 15 minutes, 30 minutes, 1 hour? Then identify the quest that set in motion the final showdown. We're moving out toward the end. Okay, that quest that gave you that information, the villain is here and is about to detonate a nuclear explosion, and you need to go and stop him. That final piece of information, what quest was it? And now think about everything that can happen in between the first presentation of the villain and the final piece of information that moves you toward the end. Everything that happens in the beginning, that's your video game's narrative through gameplay. And this is what we should focus on, because films usually have an equilibrium between the 3 acts that video games don't. You can have an opening of 1 hour and then have 100 hours of gameplay all the way until the end. So the middle part is what the player is going to spend most of his time. And you can subdivide this part into, again, 3 more acts, and every act divided into 3 acts, and so forth. But this is something that I suggest you do to train your eye, so that you might then evaluate your own work based on this analyzing of other people's work. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Luis. I'm sure everyone here appreciated it a lot. Our content will be for an unlimited time at our YouTube page, so more people can access it. And thank you very much.
Thank you, guys. It was really nice talking to you, and I hope this helps you with your projects.
Of course, I'm sure it will. Thanks. See ya.
Bye bye.
Bom, pessoal, passamos um pouquinho do tempo, 5 minutinhos, mas não podia deixar o Luis não responder e dar essa lição de casa aí muito interessante para a gente, hein? Agora não se esqueçam, vou deixar aqui no nosso chat o link para a palestra que já começou faz 5 minutinhos com os nossos organizadores, a Lia e o Kaique, nessa primeira o Kaique vai mostrar para vocês como ele vai fazer as artes ali, as ilustrações para o jogo que a Lia, no sábado de manhã, ao meio-dia, na verdade, vai transformar em um jogo, tá? Então, se você quer saber como um ilustrador faz as coisas, como preparar os assets para o seu programador colocar no jogo, não se esquece, pode entrar aqui, ó, o link já está no chat. Nos vemos daqui a pouquinho. Abraço, pessoal.